you today one question. What are you wrestling with God about? Or have you ever wrestled with God about anything? If you have, then you understand a little more where Jacob was at. Now to recap, because I know some of you were not here last week, we looked at the first part of Jacob, and Jacob was already predestined to rule over Esau, even though he was the second to come out of his mother's womb. They were twins. Unfortunately, Jacob had trouble with waiting patiently, and so he took matters in his own hands because he wanted something. He desperately wanted what his brother had, and his brother despised it. Do you remember what that was? It was his birthright. And we wondered about what really was the big thing about the birthright. Well, the birthright was the gift of the inheritance from Abraham to Isaac, to either Jacob or Esau. And that would be the link in line for the coming Messiah. And Jacob had this burning desire for it because he loved God, but Esau didn't. He despised God. He had nothing to do with God. And so Jacob didn't go about it all the right ways. But at all costs, he took what it was to get it. Well, Esau was willing to trade that birthright for nothing more than a pottage stew. So he has the birthright. Well, later on, then, Isaac becomes old, and he's going to give the blessing. Now, we also looked at the fact that God had said that Jacob was supposed to be the one blessed. However, what was Esau going to do? Isaac. Isaac took matters in his own hands, and he was going to bless Esau anyway. Well, Rachel catches wind of it. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I can't remember things this way. And she has Jacob go and dress up as though he's Esau to steal the blessing from his brother. But as we see today, with the struggle, as Jacob is wrestling with God, what is the one thing that he wants from God? He wants the blessing, right? Because Jacob knows that the first blessing that he got from his father really didn't count. Because he was dressed up as Esau. Isaac thought he was blessing Esau. So Jacob wants to make it official. Well, last week we looked at after he had gotten the birthright and he got the blessing, he gets scared, and so he runs off. His mama tells him, you need to go to my brother Laban and hide out there basically for a while. But from there is where I want you to take a wife, because it's from kindred. And we saw last week how even Laban was just as much of a deceiver as his mom, Jacob's mom, and Jacob himself. And so Jacob falls in love with Rachel. She was hot. She was good looking. She was everything he wanted in a wife. Now, I thought about that. I don't know if you chewed on that last week. And everybody looks, oh, poor Rachel and poor Jacob. That's who he was supposed to marry. And Laban deceives him the night of his wedding with Leah. We also talked about, where does the lineage of Christ come from? It doesn't come from Rachel. It comes from Leah. That's right. Have you thought about that? See, if Jacob would have been patient and he would have waited, God would have had everything work out in the plan that he already had laid out. But Jacob jumped the gun. And instead he wanted Rachel. God worked it out that he got both Leah and Rachel. Now there was one big difference between Leah and Rachel, and we find this out later in the scriptures, and that's what we read about. That Leah knew God. And she loved God. At first, she was looking for her husband Jacob to fulfill that love, to fulfill that desire, to want to be worthy in love, but it didn't happen, did it? Instead, Jacob continued to love Rachel. And finally, by the fourth child, Judah, Leah's given up all hope of getting love from Jacob. And she says, now I will praise the Lord. Now she has turned her life to God for fulfillment and her love. But did Rachel? No. And nowhere in the scriptures does it say Rachel ever even looked to God, let alone even remotely loved God. flocks, and there was a lot of deception going on between the two of them as they jostled back and forth. But in the end, Jacob ends up leaving after 21 years of being with Laban. But in that process of leaving, there's another little interesting tidbit. Rachel stole one of her father's idols. She hid it in the saddlebag, and when Laban comes after them to find the idol, she sits on it and hides it. See, her heart was so far away from God. There is no way that the Messiah was going to be born from that link in the chain. Leah, on the other hand, loved God. And she had Judah. And it's from Judah that King David came from. And then Jesus. Well, we see that Jacob has come to this spot now where he's wrestling with a lot of things in his heart. I mean, he's looking at all the things that has happened, and he's replaying in his mind the things that he did to his brother, how he deceived his father, how he's run away, but he's grown up. He's matured. What comes around goes around. Now he's been deceived by Laban, but it's made him a better man for it. And God has put this burning desire to go back home, but there's a reason for it, because God had promised Abraham that he would get the land of Canaan. And it went to Isaac, and now it's going to come to Jacob. But Jacob is off with Laban. He's not in the promised land. And the longer he stays at Laban, the more influence there is of these foreign idols. The more influence there is of his wife to pull him, his fellow way, to pull him away from God. And so God puts this burning desire to get back home to his roots. So he finds himself sitting, reminiscing about all of these things, knowing that he wants to see Esau, but so apprehensive about it because he remembers how he left things not in good shape. And being the coward that he is, he devises a plan. He's going to send the women and the children on ahead. And he's going to bring up the rear. Well, even though God knew that he was going to be a coward and that's how it was going to come down, God used that time for something special. For a one-on-one encounter. And think about this. Back then, there really was no one-on-one time, was there? Because it was a huge family and there was a lot of stuff going on all the time. There's no time to just spend in solitude with God. And so it's at this place that night, as Jacob is wrestling with what he's going to do, that God meets him right where he's at. And it says an angel of the Lord, or God himself, depending which translation you read, wrestles with him all night long. And Jacob, you have to realize, he wasn't a young guy. He was an old man by this time. And he refused to let go. Jacob knew he was wrestling with God. He knew he was wrestling with the supernatural. And even when the man touched his hip and made him lame, he still would not let go. Even when the man cries out, "Let me go," Jacob says, "Not until you what? Not until you bless me." That was the thing that he desperately coveted the most. The real blessing. Not the blessing that he deceived his dad from, but the blessing that would come from God himself, that would seal the deed, birthright, and the blessing to be the heir to the covenant. Jacob gets up in the morning after this has happened. And this was huge, because this moment was pivotal in time. It is at this point that the man asked him, "What is your name?" He wasn't asking his name. He meant, "What is the meaning of your name?" And Jacob, being sly, didn't say deceiver. He says Jacob. And the man says, "No longer are you going to be called Jacob the deceiver. You are now going to be called Jacob, Israel, the prevailer. The old is gone and the new has come." Have we had times like that in our lives? Where we come to a pivotal point. We come in as one person and we emerge as somebody totally different. Somebody stronger. Somebody richer in God. Somebody who has, Jacob says, "I have met God face to face and yet I have been saved." Abraham, who met God face to face and yet lived. We will see later on that doesn't happen again until Moses. But Moses does not see him face to face. Moses has to turn his back. So even though Jacob didn't get it right, even though Jacob had a hard time of waiting, he had a hard time of being patient, he was constantly taking matters into his own hands, thinking he knew what was best, God still used that and worked with that and turned him from the old person that he was into a new man, God. Now we see that Jacob comes before Esau, and I don't know if you have that in the scriptures, but I just love it. It reminds me of another scripture we just did not too long ago. Do you remember what that was, the 1st of October during Biker Sunday? It's the parable of the prodigal son. When the son comes back and the father sees him from a distance and he comes running to him with tears streaming in his eyes and he kisses him and he's so excited to have him back home. That's not what that son was expecting. And Jacob is going with all this apprehension, and I am sure his gut was just a churning. And he sends everybody on, and then he says, wait a minute, I'll go on ahead. And he sees Esau and 400 men running at him. What do you think was going through his mind? Anything but a homecoming. He's standing firm because he's just wrestling with God, and he won. And Esau gets to him, and he's crying, and he hugs him, and he plants a kiss on his neck. Talk about a homecoming. And Jacob is so humbled at this point. He keeps telling him, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this. See, there's a difference. Esau was blessed. And even though Esau despised God and didn't want to be part of that land, God had still blessed him with numerous wives, with much children, with much cattle, with livestock, and men. In fact, Esau had become a force to reckon with. So Esau very well could have snuffed out Jacob immediately. But he didn't, because Jacob was gone. God had worked on somebody else too. He had worked on Esau's heart. And he had softened it just for that day, preparing him for when Jacob showed up. It would be that homecoming, that reuniting. Now we're going to see later on, and we're not going to talk too much more about Jacob. We're going to go on to Joseph. But Jacob goes through a point, after he's wrestled with God, that he goes into that valley of deep sorrow. We've all been there, haven't we? Jacob cries out to God, everything is against me. Have you ever felt that way? Well, maybe we may not say everything is against me. Have you ever said, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I'm going to eat some worms and die? I say that a lot too. Woe is me. That's kind of it, isn't it? And that's kind of where Jacob's at. He's so upset, and he goes through this valley of sorrow. And it starts with his beloved nanny, who is Deborah. She dies. And shortly after that, Rachel, his beloved wife, dies in childbirth, having Benjamin. He doesn't think he can get a whole lot lower. And then after that, Isaac, his aged father, he dies, severing any chance for Jacob to try to make amends and to right the wrong for the very person he loves and the very person he deceived. And then after that, then Jacob's firstborn, you remember Reuben out of Leah? The one who is called the beginning of his strength and his might. He seduces his father's wife, his mother's maid, family. And then Judah falls in purity and ruin. And Joseph, his favorite child out of Rachel, is sold into slavery, which he does not know, and he's been deceived into thinking that he was killed by wild animals. And then the famine hits. And instead of turning to God, what does Jacob do? He says, I hear the Pharaoh in Egypt has grain. And so he sends his sons off to purchase grain. We're going to look next week into Joseph. Joseph sends back a message says no. He finds out he has another brother, which is Benjamin. And so Jacob is forced to have to raise Simeon and his son Benjamin back in Egypt. Now, the good thing is, Jacob actually is reunited with Joseph. And there's a wonderful homecoming there. But what did Jacob forfeit the most? He is now being transplanted from the land of Canaan, and he goes to live in Egypt with Pharaoh. The one thing that he was blessed with, the one thing of the covenant that was passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob was the land, the promised land of Canaan. And now he is giving it up to go live in Egypt because he turned to Pharaoh instead of to God for provisions. And that sets up a chain of events for the next 440 years. Where the Israelites will make their way back to the promised land. So see, we see that Jacob didn't get it all right. The mystery of sorrow is that God works through grief to accomplish his will. Even though we may not always see it, even though we may not always understand it, but the neat thing is, God is the God of the living. It says time and time again in the scriptures, even Jesus affirmed it, that God is the God of Jacob. God is not a God of the dead, but God of the living. And that is who we worship. We worship the living God. To this day, God is, he not was. You know, suffering at the most that we feel in life can be unjust. It can be undeserved, it can be pointless, and we can wonder, why are we going through this? Jacob found that so many times throughout his life. Why, dear Lord? He wrestled with those questions. Why is all this happening to me? A lot of it was his own doing. Some of it was from others, and just life in general. When we find ourselves crying out the same thing, everything is against me, God assures us he is in charge of a much bigger plan. The worst part of all that suffering is sometimes he requires us to wait. And wait patiently. We described what the definition of patience is. It's a continual dying to oneself, to God's will, on a daily basis. Because we can all wait, can't we? We don't have to wait patiently. But it's that maturity process, that maturing that takes place. I love this part. This is as James puts it in his book. We can take heart, no, take joy in our trials, because we know that adversity is worked to make us mature and complete, lacking nothing. See, folks, we long for maturity, but we want the quick fix. Exactly what Jacob wanted. He wanted to be mature. He wanted God's blessing, but he wanted the quick fix. He wanted all the nasty stuff to go away. But that's not how life is it? It's through those processes, through those times of waiting and wrestling with God, that we find ourselves holding on tight, gripping on to him for the answer, for the blessing, and ultimately for our inheritance as men and women, as children of the living God. So as you ponder this week about what it is that you're really wrestling with God for, take heart in knowing that through that process of wrestling, ultimately in the end, we will come out a new person and blessed.